My name is Morgan Scott, and this presentation is on an article called The Language of Implicit Preferences by Aludamini Aganaki, Yarrow Dunham, and Mazarin Banaji from Harvard University and the University of California. Their research is on language and how it influences attitudes. The previous view of attitudes was that they were stable mental representations. And the contemporary view is that attitudes are malleable when confronted with many different contextual forces, such as the time of day or the situation that occurred right before your attitudes were tested. The belief about attitudes is also that they are produced online. And now into languages. Cultural valuables or values are embedded within a language, which help construct ethnic, national, and individual identities. Languages also, when speaking in a language, this may activate the in-group preference associated with that language and affect one's attitude accordingly. And languages have been found to have influence on many non-linguistic cognitive processes, such as the conceptualization of time, grammatical gender, spatial cognition, and some aspects of social cognition. The specific research questions for study by these researchers are attitudes affected by the language in which they are expressed? Are attitudes stable, then contextually influenced, or are they produced online in context? And do individual preferences shift to accord with the cultural values embedded within a given language? The hypothesis of the researchers are that if attitudes are stable long-term memory structures, then the same speaker in the same situation should draw upon them in the same way when responding to attitude measures. But if attitudes are constructed online, then they should be influenced by the larger contextual cultural influences associated with that language. The researchers agree with the latter view, that language affects attitudes and that these attitudes are produced online. They did 2 experiments to test their hypothesis. In the first experiment, they tested Moroccan bilinguals. They tested them in both Arabic and French, and the language condition was the independent variable. They were tested in both Arabic and French, or French then Arabic, to keep control, and they were tested in these languages one after another immediately. And the dependent variable for this experiment was an IAT, or Implicit Association Test D-score. An IAT test tests the implicit attitudes of the individual within the given language. During this test, the participants must do 2 categorization tests at the same time. Specifically, within this experiment, they must categorize the names as either French or Arabic. An example of a French name would be like Pierre, and words such as good or bad. An example of a French good word or positive word would be belle. And there were Arabic equivalents to both of these. They were given 7 French names, 7 Arabic names, 7 good words, 7 bad words in each language. And the difficult part of this IAT is that there are only 2 response keys. And so, for example, in one critical block, Arabic will share a key with positive words, and in another critical block, they will share a key with negative words. So if Arabic names are considered more positive in the given language, so if they're considered more positive in Arabic, for example, then when paired with positive words, the participants will be faster and more accurate with their responses. So showing that there are more positive implicit attitudes towards Arabic names. The second experiment was the same setup, except they were tested in Spanish and English, and it was used to check if they could replicate the study, that's what it was used for. The results of these studies were that when participants were tested in Arabic, the participants showed a greater and more significant preference for Moroccan names. And when tested in French, they showed an equal preference for Moroccan and French. Remember that the participants were tested in both languages, one after another. So this shows that their preferences towards Arabic and French names changed according to which language they were tested in. So clearly they had higher preference for Moroccan names when tested in Arabic, but when tested in French, their preference for French or Arabic names became equal. And experiment 2 with the Spanish and English bilinguals, when tested in Spanish, the participants showed a significant preference for Hispanic names, and when tested in English, they showed no significant preference for Hispanic or Anglo-American names. So these results are consistent with experiment 1, so they were able to replicate their results. This showed that social attitudes towards a specific group can vary within an individual based on the language in which they are tested. So they showed higher preferences when tested in Arabic than when they were tested in French, and the participants in experiment 2 showed a preference for Hispanic names when tested in Spanish over when they were tested in English. And language influences implicit attitudes and shifts the preferences to be consistent with those of the in-group associated with the language. So when the language is Arabic, there was a higher preference for the Moroccan names over the French names. The conclusion of the study was that attitudes are indeed influenced by language, and language constructs and shapes preferences. It is not just a way to convey preferences. There are many future directions for this study, many future things that can be further emphasized through other research. Some of these things are finding the mechanisms that are directly related to these results. So what language mechanisms or what mechanisms lead language to influence the attitudes or preferences for specific names or over another? Are the results of this test an effect of language or language-attendant properties such as accent or the country-relevant priming? Which implicit attitudes are sensitive to changes in language and which ones are stable across cultures? How might the stereotypes associated with a specific language influence the results? How does the individual's identification with one language or the other, or the perception of relative status of the language, relate to the effects observed? And how do in-group biases associated with the language affect the results of the study? So there are many different things you can take from the study and expand upon. And I think that the results of the study were very interesting in showing that language can indeed shape one's attitudes towards something.